Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenforth, and Redbridge's Cos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas. Good morning, Curtinistas. Welcome back to episode 18 of Curtin's Cast. We've got a fabulous guest joining us this morning. Before I introduce Basem Abdo, good morning to my great mate, Kung Fu Cos Samaras. How are you, Cosy?
Good morning. Kalimera.
We're not going to do a long intro introducing our next guest, Basem Abdo, because we're going to dig into his backstory and he can tell his own backstory, which is a great backstory. Salam alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Shalom alaikum, Habibi. Alf Mabruk. Basem Abdo, just the very quick intro, has been recently elected as the new member for Calwell, and he's the first Palestinian Australian from a Muslim background to hold a seat in our nation's federal parliament. We had a few sort of finicky types pointing out that Joe Hockey maybe was first, but we don't really count Joe Hockey. Basem, welcome to Curtin's Cast. It's fabulous to have you here, mate.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. G'day, Nick, and g'day, Cos.
I know Cos is an old mate of yours.
Yes.
Kung Fu Cos, I heard, is referred to as.
I want that nickname, like, it needs to catch on. It desperately needs to catch on.
I actually caught up with my former fellow martial artists, kickboxers on Saturday night. So there you go.
Swift kicks all around, huh?
That's right, absolutely. Safest place in Melbourne, wherever we were on that night. I can guarantee you. Basem, thanks for joining us, mate. Just kick off by just giving us a bit of a rundown of, where you came from, where were you born, the journey, the experiences of being a refugee and, obviously coming over to this country through not the usual conventional pathways that most migrants follow.
Yeah, so I was born in Kuwait in the 80s and, very soon after I was born, a few years after the first Gulf War happened. And that was like a defining feature, more so, I think, reflecting on it for my parents, particularly my father. So when it first happened, my father was actually on his way to work that morning. Now, I don't remember it, but that's, what we reflect on. So he's on his way to work and then realised that the country had basically been taken over that morning, overnight. So he gets home. It's probably my first ever memory I have is actually my father holding me, facing a window and speaking to a soldier underneath and asking whether we should stay indoors or leave home. And I remember it. I think it's probably now I'm a new father, so I'm trying to figure out how kids absorb memory. But I remember that, so my brother and sister, and we had an older cousin at home as well, and they were visibly upset. I was young, so more of a shock than upset. So I remember that period and my father speaking to that. We had to leave Kuwait to go across to Jordan. To leave Kuwait at the time. My parents tell me that as they approached the border, they had to stay overnight at the border because the bureaucracy of war is that the plate numbers had to be changed. Kuwait became a state of Iraq, and so the plane numbers had to be changed. So it became consider Victoria, Australia, so to speak. So bureaucracy gets in the way of everything all the time. We went to Jordan for a year. We was in kindergarten, and then we came to Australia. I grew up in Melbourne's north, and I'm defined by Melbourne's north as a lot of other migrants who came to Melbourne. For me, I was always proud of our area. There's a sense of pride growing up in Melbourne's north and where you're from. A lot of the time it's defined by, north of Broady, everything north of Broady, and Broady seems to have a wide geographic expanse, basically. So it's not just Broady, it's everything around it, whether it's Roxwood Park, Greenvale, Craigieburn, more north, or even around it, even more, towards Epping. We're all Broady, basically, and Cos will probably know that as much as anyone. But I think what shaped me in that period, I have fond memories in terms of Australia. My first memory here was actually walking into the school corridor, my father speaking to the principal, and I couldn't comprehend how my father could speak to the principal in another language that I couldn't understand. And going through that, as a kid, you're absorbing, you're sort of probably, I don't know how to describe it, but you're sort of discovering. But as you get older, I think the impact would have been more on my parents and my father himself in terms of, we arrive in December, the school year starts in February, trying to get all that and get us set up and start a new life that was potentially unexpected for us, and the whole upheaval that comes with the settlement journey.
What was your dad's occupation back in Kuwait?
He was an electrical engineer.
Right.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
And he obviously wasn't able to actually transfer those skills over here. As in, when he came here, what job did he take up?
So he was technically able to. So his skills were recognised. The question is, he came in his 40s, and it was a time in the economy where you wanted a more, what do they call it, flexible workforce. And then we seem to have a system where people want either young people or people have gone through, the workforce here in Australia. And I think that's a big gap currently, even to this day, that people have in terms of transferability of skills. But the way business also attracts the workforce, I think that's a real fault line that we have. Yeah. It exists to this day. And I think it forces people into precarious work, odd jobs, and no stability, and the frustrations around not being able to exercise, the dignity of work and the dignity that employment brings. And I think that shaped me fundamentally and continues to this day.
Do you reckon, that's probably one of the biggest, I wouldn't mind, Nick, your views on this, but I think it's, the government's talking about productivity and really maximising the full value of our population. I think there's a lot of wastage that goes on in terms of our inability as a country to really tap into those those skills that migrants bring over from other parts of the world. We just let it go to waste. I mean, your dad's example is a really good one where, you could have easily tapped into that knowledge, almost by that time, 2 decades experience in that profession. And it just goes by the wayside, right? And how many of those thousands of different stories, that we could say repeated itself many times during the 90s and the turn of this century as well.
Yeah, that goes back, because it's a familiar story in Australian history. So my paternal grandmother, she was a Holocaust survivor. She was a bookkeeper and accountant in Germany and Berlin. She had to work as a nanny in London when they got to London, thank God, in 1938. And then when she came to Australia, single mum, she worked at the GPO. So she'd been a sort of white-collar professional, and that avenue was shut off. And, it's a familiar story. Our chair, Sam Al-Maliki, his dad also, they were refugees from Saddam Hussein's regime. Sam's dad was highly qualified, very successful political scientist in Iraq. Yeah. He didn't work as an academic in Australia. I think he worked, I think he drove taxis.
Yeah, there you go. There's another good example.
And this is a great country, but we don't always get it right in terms of tapping into and using the amazing life experiences and actual technical expertise. This
is a critical area, right? And this is very much the story of Calwell, the electorate you represent. Yep. And I know personally, I've grown up in the same part of the world that Basem has, and I still live in that part of the world as well, and so does Basem. But, it probably feeds into some of that growing disquiet that exists within diverse communities, and that is this presumption that migrants, come to this country and they add to the burden rather than actually add value. you have very qualified people from other parts of the world who come here, and many of them proportionally in great numbers, obviously land in Melbourne's northwestern suburbs, and they end up driving cabs and Ubers and delivering food.
And particularly what people don't recognise is that it's not just a certificate that people have. They usually work in places where there is a diverse workforce. There's an expat community that they work among. So they understand international context in terms of dealing. They understand diversity on top of the skill sets that they bring. And I think to your point, it's something that we're missing out on as a country. And the narrative has been around, to your point, Cos, that somehow the country has to carry them. I think, they've got a lot to contribute, and they have, and it really impacts families and their children and everything else in terms of that capacity.
You've got a lot to contribute, Basem. I'm really excited to see what you're going to bring to federal parliament, and you've got a great backstory. Tell us about your working life. So I believe you flipped burgers at Tullamarine Airport. That was your first job. My first job was washing dishes at a terrible ununionised restaurant. That was actually quite formative for me, mate, because I saw how, I was 17, 18, and we were treated like shit. And it was really formative to me. And the second job I got was in retail. I was covered by the SDA, and I was treated decently. It was those few years were quite formative for me. I was already really a Labor left-wing guy, but, the first experience of work can be really formative. So tell us about that. You've also had experience working in the private sector, but also working as an advisor for Maria. Tell us about your working life and how you think that's going to shape the way that you represent the people of Calwell.
Well, my first job was actually at Hungry Jack's in the Qantas terminal. And as I came to Canberra yesterday, I walked past it and I stopped for a moment. That first job, I took the interview when I was 14 years and 6 months, and the legal working age was 14 years and 9 months. So I got the job, and my dad was with me in the interview, but I had to wait a few more months until I could actually legally start. To me, it was a necessity in the sense that you understand that you've got a role as well in a family unit to work, to also support in that respect. But also it was, it gives you confidence building in terms of how you engage and everything else around that. I will never forget that first job, but I've gone through as well in terms of, worked in retail, hospitality. I did car detailing at one point in Brighton, Toyota. So you'd catch the bus from Roxy to Broadie Station, Broadmeadow Station, and then
2 hours.
2 trains, and then I think it's a Nepean Highway where Brighton Toyota was, or is. Yeah, and then you go wash. But you did what you had to do. You never sort of at the time feel like it's an overly burdensome thing, but you just did what you had to do. It was common for people in that area, whether they go across the other side of the city or whether it's just something you did, right? It's a common story within our community. All of those helped me in terms of getting the professional life that I did. Most of my professional life has been in the private sector, primarily IT companies, whether cybersecurity, distribution, but also business process management. Which actually took me to Germany to work. The company was a German headquartered, Berlin actually. You mentioned Berlin, Nick. Berlin headquartered company, but they had set up offices in Melbourne, and then they asked me to set up a department, so I went there to set up, and then the COVID situation hit us, which I came back to Australia actually at that time thinking that COVID's a European problem and it'll be a few weeks, and I'll take some time. I'll take some time off in Victoria. Little did I know, Victoria, what was going to happen.
Was it easy to get back, or
to get back at the time? Yes, because it was still like I remember we were watching it, and Italy was, I think, 2 weeks ahead of the cycle in Germany at the time. So it was following a pattern, and then they realised it was serious. We got an email from work saying Monday would be your last day, grab all your stuff and then stay at home. And I had no intention of sitting in an apartment in Berlin. So I decided to come back. I rang home, no COVID in Australia. All right, we're coming home for a few weeks. I got stuck in Melbourne. They carried on with summer and went on with life. So the rest is history. But I've also worked as a parliamentary staffer. I think that people undervalue that role, the role of a staffer. I think you have an interaction with people in a different respect. People often come to you at their most vulnerable. They come to you when, they value the role of government. It's not always members of parliament can help with everything in terms of solving the problem, but it's a touch point for people when they need government, I think, and federal government, which I was involved in. So it was a role that actually allowed me to understand people's interface with government. I'm from the area, so a lot of the issues that people touched on are familiar to me, and some of them I've experienced myself, but to understand people's interaction really gave me a lot of value, and to understand the power that Parliament also holds in assisting your constituency, and to never forget that the role of Parliament in Canberra is actually to have the voice of your community heard.
We're moving on to Calwell now. It is one of the most diverse electorates in the country. What are the sort of hopes, fears, and frustrations that you hear most on the ground and during the election?
It is one of the most diverse communities in Australia. I think on a broader point across the board, I think people know they come from the area, and I think the area, I don't know what the word is. Is it a noun? It's that area for us, right? It's everything is that area, and we know that when we come from the area, that people more often have to try that bit harder, have to excel harder, and there's been a traditional feeling that governments haven't actually met the aspirations of people in our community, and so there's a gap between the role of government and meeting the aspirations of working people. And we see that in that people traditionally have been sort of victims of government policy. I use manufacturing as an example. We had the Ford factory. People built their lives around Ford. We had communities, suburbs were built around Ford, and not just Ford, but the entire economic supply chain around Ford. So the whole Hume Highway had a whole industry built around Ford. Ford itself, at its peak, I think had around 8,000 workers or so. So then with a budgetary decision, you mentioned the other Palestinian in Parliament, but smoking cigars and on the balcony of Parliament House.
It's a great look, isn't it? What a great look.
A great look, but it shows how communities weren't engaged in that decision making, and government wasn't receptive to the needs of the community, and there was no transition. Industries might change, but there was no transition. People just had to suffer through it. And I think that gap people have been conscious of in our community for a very long time, and they want government to be responsive to their needs in their community. They know government won't solve everything all the time, but they want government to actually have them in mind. And I think that goes across working communities. And I'm not afraid to use the word working class. I don't think our community is shy from saying we're working class. I'm proudly from a working class background, but we're not the rugged trousered workers who want to remain, the noble working class. We also aspire to actual social mobility. And so when we look at things like what does childcare do to families that allows, families to get back into the workforce, we can't afford in our community, many families can't afford to just stop work or stop life. They set back dramatically. That's why, I interviewed for a job at Hungry Jack's. It was 14 years and 6 months, and I kept doing odd, precarious work all the way through until I was able to get into professional life. No chance of a gap year, no holidays in Europe for Kentucky tours. It was all about trying to ensure that, you maintain some sort of continuity, because if you fell off that ledge, you would be set back, and you didn't have a family safety net, basically, that you could fall back on. So our community, it's a community of aspiration. It wants to be able to secure a home. It wants to be able to secure good, secure and well-paying jobs that provide people with long-term careers. And I think that's a fundamental piece in our area.
This is the thing about governments in general in this country. Basem, you just basically brilliantly articulated the problem that has befallen manufacturing communities in this country and across the world, right? So at the moment, there is a lot of political energy being put into helping communities that have been impacted by the transition process, so moving away from coal and so on, and helping those communities make that transition. Millions and millions of dollars have been spent there. How much do you think was spent helping the manufacturing communities of Calwell and other parts of the country, particularly during the Abbott years? And Turnbull and Morrison, well, not much at all, basically front of the scrap heap. And that's the fundamental problem. And that is that I think also the left side of politics has really taken its eye off the ball in, attributing the blame to, yes, that government. They were the ones who pretty much landed the final blow. There were many other blows landed to that industry, but it was definitely the final blow, and it was seismic in its impact.
And there was a failure to imagine what a future manufacturing industry looks like. And I think that failure has made a lot of people in our community view manufacturing as the old school type, as jobs of the past. And so as we're trying to transition into this new economy, which takes in green technology, which for our community, predominantly speaking, is not a green environmental issue. It's about jobs. Government's failure to put that forward and articulate that and actually have reskilling of a workforce, I think that's been a big negative and a big loss to Australia, actually, a very big loss to our country.
Oh, and you spoke about COVID before. That's when it was all exposed.
Yeah,
all these globalized supply chains, they crumbled, and we couldn't produce PPE gear. This idea, it's something I've been banging the drum for. Cos sometimes accuses me of being a partisan. I'm really critical of the Labor Party's response to the shutdown of the car manufacturing industry. I think there was still this view that it's inevitable. And nothing's inevitable. This was a political decision. So we sort of sat there, we'd laugh at Joe Hockey smoking a cigar with Matthias Cormann and said, oh, this is terrible, they've done this. But I think we should have stood up and said, no, this industry and the flow-on effects to other supply chains, it's too big to fail. And we should have gone to the 2016 election saying, no, we're not going to accept this. These are our people, and we're going to look after them. Now, I know that sounds sort of sentimental and really old school Labor, and then people go, oh, Nick's living in the past, he's knee-deep in nostalgia, but, that's my view of the world. Manufacturing is really important, and I love that you're passionate about it. Where do you see the future in terms of rebooting manufacturing, and how can that play out in the ground in terms of jobs and livelihoods for the people of Calwell?
Well, I think if you look at manufacturing, so traditionally in days there was mechanical production, and then we went on to mass production, and then we're in the age of, or just finishing or touching on the age of the automation age, and we're going to move into probably Dulux in Mickleham. In my lecture is a perfect example of that cyber physical world where basically you don't have that mass plant and assembly line. You actually have computerized, digitized data, which allows you to produce prototypes of samples that are much smaller in a much smaller amount of time. And so that's where we're at the moment, and that's where the world is sort of heading to. And so there's a tension there between automating, making things efficient, and the fact that factories like Dulux and Mickleham have a smaller workforce. So the challenge for governments around the world and for Australia would be, how do you ensure that we have enough industry that's willing to invest in communities such as ours, with a workforce that can skill across industries? So government has a fundamental role to play, both in investment, but in creating the environment to make that happen. So you can You do things like manufacturing hubs. I was a big advocate for a common user facility in the other side of town in the west, to have government help invest with education sector and private business to actually create hubs. So, small to medium enterprises may not have the capital to pay for the machines individually. If you have hubs that are linked in the similar industries across the supply chain, they may all utilize that. Government can use its resources to invest in that initial capital whilst having, whether it's a vet sector, and there needs to be more collaboration between the vet sector and higher education in these spaces, to actually be able to skill workers and reskill workers. It's not just new, workers coming, young people coming to the workforce, but people who are reskilling as well, or upskilling. There needs to be a real effort put towards that. But also, what's the role of government in terms of strategic procurement, in terms of investing in that? There is a strong role for government in that. And I think it's, we talk about the deindustrialization of societies in general, but I think there is an opportunity now for countries, because we're pretty much, a lot of the industrialized countries are on this, tackling the same problem at the moment. So there's a chance to actually reindustrialize your society, and only government can do that in the capacity and in the way that makes sure that we're tackling what working people need to build communities around those industries. So you've got your hubs, you've got your investments, you've got your education sector that's around that, and actually picking out what those. So when people talk about green technologies, to me, it's about where the market's going. It's going towards that, and that's where it is. Like I said, for many people, yes, there's an environmental benefit, but primarily it's jobs. And if government backs that in, I think we have a real opportunity.
Particularly for young people.
The Indian diaspora, for example, that is in, obviously the call is the home to thousands upon thousands of Indian Australians. One of the highest educated migrant constituencies in the country. They'll wrap their arms around these opportunities if they existed into the future. So you've got almost a ready-made workforce there that will not only from a qualification perspective is ready-made for it, but also culturally it's what they're looking for.
Yeah. Well, that's what does Australia's industrial comeback look like? Yeah. People have an idea of manufacturing, that it's the smoky manufacturing plant next to the takeaway shops in industrial areas. But, and that was good. It served communities, and we're, in communities such as ours, we're very proud of that. But in what's reshaping in the new manufacturing industry is a different type of manufacturing worker. And we're seeing manufacturing as a percentage of output in the economy has reduced dramatically, but consumption of manufacturing goods hasn't, right? So why aren't we making those things here in Australia? What value add do we have? And if there's an investment in a workforce that's able to build their lives around that, I think Australia benefits. And to me, if you're proudly Australian, the Australian flag doesn't just sit on your flagpole in front of your house. It should sit on our products.
Just speaking of houses there, Basem.
Yeah.
One of the biggest problems we've got at the moment is we've got a housing supply crisis.
Yep.
So one of the things, actually, the Curtin Research Centre, we're going to be publicising a bit of work on this in the next month or two, is there's a terrible word for it. It's called modular housing, but we call it manufactured housing.
Yep.
It is a way of reindustrialising and actually giving people high quality, well-paid, good union jobs and solving a public policy issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Like pre-confab homes, I think.
And
so absolutely.
Like top quality, environmentally sustainable, top quality. So it solves a practical problem and it gives people good jobs, which can also be transferred to other, as we're talking about reindustrialising as, a 10, 15, 20-year project, we're talking about building up transferable skills as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there'll be buy-in from the community with that, because not only are they working in those industry, but it's actually, they can see that, how it translates to their own communities, and access to homes. And it is difficult to acquire a home, and there's a lot of luck in it. Yeah.
You made a very good point just before, and that is how the left side of politics, for example, should talk about nationalism. You made reference to the flag. It shouldn't be just something you put in front of your house. It should be on your products.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Absolutely.
And that's using this particular policy area as a way of, be it this Labor government and the left in general, to re-engage with that blue Labor approach, which is, that patriotism, isn't just
family flag. Yeah,
that's right. It isn't just about the beat the war drum every time that Australia Day comes around, because it means that doesn't actually improve the lives of people. What the drum you need to be beating as a political movement is the types of jobs you're creating. And
that's a failure of the left, I think, Cos.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I still haven't understood why in my own head why the word progressive doesn't sit well with me, because I think it's more generally speaking, it hasn't captured the class element.
Do you know why?
And I don't. Yeah.
Why? This is my old joke. What's the last thing you want to hear when you head to your GP?
What is it?
It's progressive.
Well, that's definitely, and most men are scared to go to the GP anyway. So
that was my cheeky little job. I don't think you'd be scared to go to the GP. And you also, you can test. Let's talk about the campaign in Calwell. Cos had a very close eye on matters here. It was a robust contest. It was a contest which wasn't without tension. There was a lot of focus on your identity as Basem Abdo, Palestinian Australian, but not actually the policies which you stand for and are passionate for that we've been talking about for the last 15 or 20 minutes. Did that surprise you, or have you developed a sort of thick skin and you thought that would come with the territory?
To be honest, I wish it surprised me, but it didn't. And that's the unfortunate bit. And I think what people missed is people in our area have always grown up with being defined by who they are and where they're from, and not what they have to bring to the table. So, you go anywhere across Melbourne and the first two questions would be what nasho are you and what area you're from. And nasho being nationality and what area. People are trying to define you, right? They're trying to qualify you. Now, in a pub, it's more crude, where they're coming from. In the professional life, they aim to qualify you in that. That attempt was made at me throughout the campaign. But, we remained focused on, what Labor has to offer. What Labor has to offer working people, disciplined approach. There was a whole host of candidates, and if we stood and were distracted every time a new independent or otherwise candidate was declared, we wouldn't have been able to do anything. And I think we remained disciplined on that. And having grown up in the area and having then sought to represent people in our community, in our area, I wasn't going to let that distract me at all.
And because also let me into a secret, you had good reason to be distracted because you became a father during the campaign. Is that right?
I did, yeah, I did. He actually, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, he came, the little one, little Noah, he came home on election day, actually. He was born early. I was born early, so he spent some time in hospital. It's very, look, I don't talk much about my personal life at all, and a lot happened during that campaign on a personal level in terms of loss and in terms of grief.
Yes.
So it was very tough in that perspective. It was very difficult in that perspective, but I had to get back onto the campaign very quickly and probably sooner than one should. But I had to do it because I felt a responsibility to the party that backed in a local candidate, but also to the community that I sought to represent. So I haven't addressed that period at the moment, and I'll talk about it maybe another time.
You experienced some loss then, so again, my people, long life to you and your family. Again,
thank you.
I think testament to your character that you were able to endure this, and some of the murky unsavoury elements of the campaign in Calwell, which causes all over it.
Oh, look, I'm looking forward to Disclosure Day, as I like to call it, next year. Which is, for those listening, that's when those who donated to particular campaigns and parties have to disclose if they have donated in excess of, I think it's $13,500. I think that's the threshold. Yeah, it's. I'm looking forward to that. It'll be my Christmas.
Awesome. That's a wonderful little vignette of you walking past Hungry Jack's at the airport. You're now in Canberra. You're kind of doing your on-the-job training there. It's unusual because it's kind of like it's just not a job you really sort of don't get a specific.
Well, I had to miss a session from the leader of the house to be with you two. So if I get in trouble,
mate. Just blame me. Blame me because most people in and around the Labor Party just generally blame us for various problems. So we've got thick skins. We'll get through that. If you could sort of go in 3 years' time when you seek re-election, you go, this is the big win I got for the people of Calwell. What would it be?
Well, firstly, as a local MP, to be delivering on our commitments that we took to election. But I fundamentally want to ensure that our communities shape national policy and the conversations that impact national policy. So, the Treasurer spoke about productivity reforms, and whilst I haven't sat with the Treasurer or picked his brain on this, and I don't speak on behalf of the government in that respect, but I think I'm confident it'll lean towards the people who voted the Australian Labor Party in, and it'll have them in mind. And I believe that our community should be at the forefront, and it'll be my effort to make sure it is at the forefront. A lot of what we spoke about, I think, must be as part of that conversation, part of what the new economy looks like, part of ensuring that working people have policies reflected that serve their interests, but on a practical level, understanding what that looks like and how that's implemented in our community.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke about productivity. Cos and I have spoken about productivity. Again, I think that's where something like prefab, modular housing, manufactured housing might come in, because at the moment we've got the banks just lending money to people to buy houses. That doesn't do anything for productivity, but if we're building and manufacturing housing and perhaps bringing in AI-related technologies, that's actually a way to boost productivity. But how do you think on the ground? Cos sort of took me to task about this the other week. If the good burgers, the good people of Calwell, do you think they're up for a conversation around productivity, or do you think when they hear the word productivity, and it is a really big issue, like we have to do something about stagnant productivity in this country, but when they hear the word productivity and the need to boost productivity, what do you think an ordinary person in Calwell thinks? Are they up for the conversation? Do they think it's just about cutting labour standards, squeezing wages?
Well, that's the traditional understanding of productivity in working communities, because, productivity has always been a code word for cutting the workforce. When you make things more efficient, you're basically just saying we're going to squeeze the hell out of you until, to the very last drop. To me, a conversation around productivity needs to actually translate to working people in terms of what does it look like for you and your capacity to get into the workforce? What does work look like for you? Are there long-term, secure, stable jobs that provide careers? Can you build a life around the fact that you have secure employment, or at least secure industry that you can you can skill or reskill? That needs to translate in communities across Australia, and particularly in communities such as mine. So if our economies are not anchored, our local communities are not anchored in that policy, then it wouldn't have worked. But I'm confident that it will be. We have a Labor Treasurer in a Labor government that had the mandate to deliver that, and I'm confident it will take my community's interests. I just will ensure that that conversation is had. So when we talk about automation, when we talk about AI, it's not in the context of how many jobs will that replace. It's how many people will we skill in our communities to be able to work in fields that utilize those technologies. And if things about efficiency mean it's not just about one factory making things quicker, it's about, efficiency in the fact that we've now got an industry, and an industry in all its parts across all its supply chain that's Australian made, that is Australian workforce, that is skills, Australian people here locally in terms of being able to get into the workforce and move around. That's productivity in my view, and if it will hopefully work in that respect.
You mentioned Jim Chalmers. He, obviously grew up in Logan, very similar constituency to the electorate you represent. His electorate very similar. Although he's obviously not, he's born and bred here, but he would, I think, at the forefront of his mind, who have his community as well. So I think the Labor side of politics, when talking about this issue and tackling this policy area, are probably in a safe pair of hands.
And I think he recognises that not only must these policies work to meet the aspirations of working people in communities like Logan or Calwell, but also the threat to democracy that we have, that we're seeing in Europe. If we don't address this, there's a model up there in Europe, and what that does, and what the fracturing of the left and the consequences of that, and the consequences of the left when there's a self-sabotage in the fact that they have no capacity to build coalitions, but everything is perfect. And then what happens, like we saw in France recently, it went back to the right, went back to the conservatives because, they couldn't decide whether it was which left of the left was more pure. And I think it's not an intellectual exercise or a theoretical exercise. Economic policy needs to translate for working people, and that's the left's challenge.
So, Basem, we are sort of running out of time. If you have a message to the people of Calwell, but especially the young working class people who are watching your journey over the next 3 years, hopefully, decades-long career in Canberra, what would be your message to those people?
I'd say be proud of our area, be proud of the human capital that exists within our area and the potential. I would say that we will define ourselves, and we will shape our community, and we'll fight for it, and we'll fight for it in every avenue. And that our community deserves its place in the Australian economy. And to the point earlier that we made, there was a thread throughout this podcast, is that we're not limited to the geography of where we sit in our state and in our country, but that we will have the capacity to actually rebuild and be the future of Australia's manufacturing workforce, or the workforce more broadly.
Good advice. We are just about out of time. I'm advertising. Here's our magazine, Toxin, edition 23, which came out a few weeks ago, featuring Kung Fu Cos Samaras there. It's a really good edition. And speaking of young people, we've published a number of really thoughtful young people, from Townsville to Sydney to here in Melbourne, and also quite ethnically diverse as well. It's a really good edition. You can jump online and read that at curtinrc.org. The other thing, Curtinistas, which you need to do, because you've got about 5 days left, is on the 5th of July in Sydney at Doltoni House in Piermont. We are hosting Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who will be delivering the 2025 Curtin oration. This year, the 5th of July, marks the 80th anniversary of the passing of the great John Curtin, and we will be paying tribute to Curtin and Albo, who's just delivered Labor its greatest victory since Curtin in 1943. Head to curtinrc.org or our socials at Facebook, Insta, we're even on TikTok there, Kung Fu Cos, the superstar TikToker. Do not miss out on this history-making event. But Basem, thank you. Shukran Habibi. Thank you, Kung Fu Cos. It's been a real pleasure, Basem, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you represent the good people of Calwell and Melburnians, Victorians and Australians generally.
Thanks, mate. A Joe Rogan-style podcast, and we didn't mention UFOs once, so well done to you both as well.
Yeah, I could be the Joe Rogan of Australian political podcasts. Thanks, gents.
Thanks, guys.
And thanks, Curtinistas. We'll see you next week. Ciao Arrivederci.